There's nothing more heartbreaking than watching a good man realize the world no longer has room for him. After 30 years of honest work, Rex Dalton discovers that loyalty means nothing when times get hard. The ranchers who once depended on his strong back and steady hands now call him too expensive to feed during the drought. At 52, Rex packs his few belongings and prepares to ride away from the only town he's ever called home. The whispers follow him down Main Street about the giant cowboy who costs more than he's worth. But just as he's about to disappear into the endless prairie, Victoria Meadows steps out of her inn. She's a widow with her own struggles, but she sees something in Rex that the other townspeople have forgotten. What happens when two lonely souls decide they're tired of carrying their burdens alone? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun had been cruel to Copper Ridge that summer, baking the earth until it cracked like old leather and turning the once green pastures into stretches of dust and dying grass. Rex Dalton had watched it all happen from horseback, riding the fence lines and checking water holes that grew smaller each day. He'd seen drought before, every rancher in Texas had, but this one felt different. This one had teeth. Standing now in the shade of Murphy's General Store, Rex adjusted the weight of his worn leather saddlebags across his shoulder. Everything he owned in the world fit into those bags. 3 changes of clothes, his father's old Bible, a photograph of his parents from their wedding day, and $47 in crumpled bills. Not much to show for 30 years of breaking horses and mending fences, but it was honest money, every cent of it. The saddlebags had been his father's before him, crafted from good cowhide and stitched with care. They'd traveled thousands of miles together, from the cattle drives of his youth to the settled ranch work of his middle years. Now they carried the weight of his dignity as much as his possessions. A man could lose his job, his home, even his hope, but as long as he carried himself with dignity, he still had something worth holding on to. Rex remembered when Tom Morrison first hired him at the Double M Ranch. He'd been 22 then, all muscle and ambition, fresh off his father's small spread that had gone under in the recession of '93. Tom had looked him up and down, noted the way Rex sat his horse and handled the rope, and said simply, "You'll do." For 3 decades, Rex had made sure those words stayed true. But yesterday, Tom couldn't meet his eyes when he delivered the news. The drought had hit the Double M harder than most. Cattle were dying, feed costs had tripled, and the bank was asking uncomfortable questions. Tom needed to cut expenses, and Rex, at 52 and eating twice what the younger hands consumed, was the most expensive cut he could make. "It ain't about your work, Rex," Tom had said, his voice thick with regret. "Lord knows you're worth 3 of any other man I could hire, but right now I can't afford to feed you proper, and you're too good a man to ask to work hungry." The words had hit Rex like a physical blow, but he'd absorbed them the way he'd learned to absorb the kick of an angry bronco, with silence and steady breathing. He'd nodded once, shaken Tom's hand, and walked away without looking back. Pride was about all he had left, and he wasn't going to waste it on arguments or pleading. The other ranchers in town had given him similar answers when he'd quietly made his rounds. Times were hard, money was tight. They all respected him, they said, but respect didn't fill feed troughs or pay banknotes. By sunset yesterday, Rex had accepted what he'd been trying to avoid admitting for weeks. Copper Ridge no longer had room for him. Now, as he stood in the morning shadows, preparing to mount his horse for the last time in this town, Rex felt the weight of every whispered conversation that had followed him down Main Street. "There goes the giant cowboy," they'd say, not always unkindly, but always with that note of pity that cut deeper than any harsh word. Shame about Rex Dalton. Good man, but too big to keep when times get lean. His horse, a steady sorrel gelding named Jasper, nickered softly as Rex approached. The animal had been his one extravagance over the years, purchased with saved wages and cared for better than Rex often cared for himself. Jasper was getting on in years too, his muzzle showing grey, but he was still sound and willing. They'd figure out their next destination together, the way they'd figured out everything else. Rex was sliding his saddlebags into place when he heard the rustle of silk skirts behind him. He turned to see Victoria Meadows approaching from across the dusty street, her posture erect despite the early hour and the weight of whatever had drawn her from her inn. Victoria Meadows was a puzzle that had intrigued the town for the three. Years since she'd arrived from back east. A widow in her late 50s, she carried herself with the bearing of someone accustomed to finer things, yet she'd chosen to run a small inn in a rough cattle town at the edge of nowhere. Her dark hair, now touched with silver at the temples, was always perfectly arranged, and her dresses, while practical, showed the hand of an expensive seamstress. The inn she'd purchased and renovated sat at the respectable end of Main Street, its white-painted walls and green shutters, a stark contrast to the weathered storefronts surrounding it. The Meadows Inn, as she'd christened it, provided clean rooms and decent meals for travellers, but it had never quite thrived the way Victoria had clearly hoped it would. Rex had eaten there a few times over the years, always noting how she moved. Through the dining room with quiet efficiency, her smile professional but distant. There had been speculation, of course. A woman like Victoria didn't end up in a place like Copper Ridge without a story behind her. Some said she was running from scandal back east. Others claimed she was protecting a fortune from grasping relatives. Rex had always figured her reasons were her own business, but he'd noticed the way she sometimes stood at her upstairs window in the evenings, looking out at the prairie with an expression he recognized. It was the look of someone who understood loneliness. "Mr. Dalton," she said now, her voice carrying the cultured accent that marked her as an outsider, even after 3 years. "I was hoping to catch you before you left town." Rex touched the brim of his hat, a gesture so automatic it required no thought. "Ma'am, Mrs. Meadows, didn't expect to see anyone stirring this early." "I've always been an early riser," she replied, though something in her tone suggested she'd had little sleep. "I heard about your situation. I'm sorry." The words were simple, but they carried none of the awkward pity that had seasoned most of the condolences he'd received. Victoria Meadows had simply stated a fact and expressed genuine regret. Rex found himself studying her face more carefully than he ever had before, noting the intelligence in her dark eyes and the strength in the set of her jaw. "Appreciate that, ma'am. Sometimes things just run their course." Victoria was quiet for a moment, her gaze taking in the packed saddlebags and Jasper's readiness for travel. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note of decision that suggested she'd been wrestling with her words for some time. "I have a proposition for you, Mr. Dalton. I know we've barely spoken over the years, but I've observed enough to know you're a man of integrity and capability. My inn—" She paused, seeming to gather herself. "My inn requires more maintenance than I can manage alone, and I find myself in need of someone reliable to handle the heavier work." Rex felt a flicker of something that might have been hope, but he'd learned to be wary of charity, dressed up as opportunity. "That's kind of you, ma'am, but I'm not offering charity," Victoria said firmly, as if she'd read his thoughts. "I'm offering employment, room and board plus wages for honest work. I've watched you handle everything from spooked horses to drunk cowboys with the same steady competence. That's exactly what I need." There was something in her tone that made Rex look at her more carefully. Victoria Meadows stood before him with her chin raised and her shoulders square, but there was a tremor in her hands she was trying to hide. Whatever was driving this offer, it wasn't simple kindness. She needed something from him as much as he needed what she was offering. "What kind of work are we talking about?" Rex asked carefully. "Repairs, maintenance, dealing with difficult guests when necessary. The inn sees all kinds of travellers, and sometimes a steady presence is required to maintain order. I can offer you the small room behind the kitchen and 3 meals a day, plus $15 a week. $15 was less than half what he'd made at the Double M, but it was $15 more than he had prospects for anywhere else. More importantly, it was work offered with dignity rather than pity. Victoria Meadows was giving him a reason to stay that had nothing to do with charity and everything to do with mutual need. "Might I ask why you're making this offer, Mum? We've barely exchanged 100 words in 3 years." Victoria's smile was slight but genuine. "Perhaps that's exactly why, Mr. Dalton. In my experience, a man who keeps his own counsel and handles his business quietly is worth a dozen who feel compelled to prove themselves with noise and bluster." Rex considered this, his hand resting on Jasper's neck. The horse shifted slightly, patient, but ready for whatever decision his master would make. Around them, Copper Ridge was beginning to stir. Soon the street would fill with the usual bustle of morning commerce, and Rex would either be part of it or riding away from it forever. "I won't take charity," he said finally. "I'm not offering any. I'm offering a job to a man who needs one from a woman who needs help. Nothing more, nothing less." Rex studied Victoria's face, looking for any sign of pity or condescension. He found neither. What he saw instead was a woman who understood something about pride and necessity. Someone who knew the difference between helping and humbling. "When would you want me to start?" "Today, if you're willing. I have a list of repairs that's been growing longer every week." Rex nodded slowly, making his decision. He'd always believed in taking care of the work in front of him rather than worrying about what might come after. Right now, Victoria Meadows was offering him work, shelter, and the chance to stay in the only place he'd ever really called home. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was better than riding into uncertainty with $47 and no prospects. "Then I accept your offer, Mrs. Meadows. I'll do right by you." Victoria's smile broadened, and for the first time since he'd known her, it reached her eyes. "I believe you will, Mr. Dalton. Welcome to the Meadows Inn." As Rex began untying his saddlebags from Jasper's saddle, he noticed how the morning light caught the silver threads in Victoria's hair and softened the lines of worry around her eyes. There was more to Victoria Meadows than the town knew, more than perhaps even she was ready to reveal. But that was all right with Rex. He'd always believed that the best stories were the ones people told when they were ready, not when others demanded to hear them. The sun was climbing higher now, promising another scorching day. But for the first time in weeks, Rex Dalton wasn't facing it alone. As he followed Victoria Meadows across the dusty street toward the white-painted walls of her inn, he carried his leather saddlebags with something that felt remarkably like hope. The room Victoria showed Rex was smaller than a horse stall, but cleaner than any bunkhouse he'd ever inhabited. A narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out on the inn's back garden comprised the entire space. It smelled of soap and sunshine rather than sweat and tobacco, a pleasant change that made him realize how tired he was of living rough. "I know it's not much," Victoria said, lingering in the doorway as Rex set his saddlebags on the bed. "It's more than enough. Ma'am, haven't had a room to myself since I was a boy on my father's place." Victoria nodded, though something in her expression suggested she understood the weight behind those simple words. "Breakfast is at 6, dinner at noon, supper at 7. If you're working late, I can always keep a plate warm. Appreciate that. What would you like me to start with?" Victoria pulled a folded piece of paper from her apron pocket, its edges worn from handling. "I've been keeping a list. The porch steps are loose, the stable door won't latch properly, and there's a leak in the dining room ceiling that gets worse. Every time it rains." Rex accepted the list, scanning the careful handwriting that detailed a dozen different problems. Each item was precisely described, with notes about materials needed and urgency marked in the margins. It was the work of someone who paid attention to details and planned ahead, qualities Rex had always respected. "I can get started on the steps this morning. You have tools in the shed behind the stable. My late husband was handy with repairs, so most everything should be there. The mention of her husband was the first personal detail Victoria had shared, and Rex noted how her voice softened when she spoke of him. He'd heard mention of Mr. Meadows around town, but had never gotten a clear picture of the man beyond the fact that he'd died young and left his wife with enough money to buy the inn. By mid-morning, Rex had discovered that Victoria's list only scratched the surface of what needed attention. The inn was well built, but showing its age, and it was clear that some repairs had been postponed for financial reasons rather than oversight. The loose porch steps were actually rotted through in places, requiring replacement rather than simple tightening. The stable door needed new hinges, not just adjustment of the latch. As Rex worked, he became aware of the town's eyes on him. Copper Ridge was small enough that everyone noticed when routines changed, and his presence at the Meadows Inn was already generating comment. Mrs. Patterson from the dry goods store made a point of walking past twice during the morning, her gaze lingering on the inn's front porch where Rex was replacing boards. Sheriff Hawthorne stopped by on his regular rounds, ostensibly to check on Victoria, but clearly curious about her new employee. "Heard you took on some help, Victoria," the sheriff said, his tone carefully neutral. Victoria emerged from the inn carrying a glass of water for Rex, her timing impeccable. "Mr. Dalton has agreed to handle some repairs for me. The place has been needing attention." Sheriff Hawthorne studied Rex with the measuring gaze of a man accustomed to sizing up potential trouble. Rex continued his work on the porch steps, neither hurrying nor slowing his pace, letting his competence speak for itself. "Rex Dalton," the sheriff said finally, "heard about your situation at the Double M. Sorry about that." "Obliged," Rex replied, not looking up from his work. "You planning to stay in town?" "For now." The sheriff nodded, apparently satisfied with the brief exchange. Rex had learned long ago that lawmen respected men who kept their answers short and their business to themselves. After a few more pleasantries with Victoria, Sheriff Hawthorne continued his rounds, but Rex noticed how the man's eyes lingered on the inn as he walked away. It was during the dinner hour, when the inn's dining room filled with its usual mix of traveling salesmen and local widowers who preferred Victoria's cooking to their own, that Rex discovered the true nature of Victoria's situation. He was replacing a rotted board on the back steps when he heard raised voices coming from the inn's front parlor. "Can't continue to extend these terms indefinitely, Mrs. Meadows." Rex recognized the voice as belonging to Arthur Pemberton, president of Copper Ridge's only bank. He'd never liked the man, who had a reputation for calling in loans when borrowers were most vulnerable. "I understand your position, Mr. Pemberton, but as I explained, the inn's revenue has been affected by the drought. Fewer travelers, less business." Victoria's voice remained level, but Rex could hear the tension beneath her professional composure. He found himself moving closer to the kitchen door, ostensibly to examine the window frame, but actually to hear the conversation more clearly. "The drought affects everyone, ma'am, but it doesn't suspend contractual obligations. You're 3 months behind on your payments, and the bank's board is asking questions I can't continue to deflect." 3 months behind. Rex felt something cold settle in his stomach. Victoria's offer of employment suddenly took on a different dimension. She wasn't just looking for help with repairs. She was fighting to keep her in. "How long do I have?" Victoria asked quietly. "I can give you until the end of September. 3 months to bring your payments current, or we'll have no choice but to begin foreclosure proceedings." Rex heard the rustle of papers and the sound of a chair scraping against the floor. Through the kitchen window, he watched Pemberton emerge from the inn and walk toward his buggy, his face wearing the satisfied expression of a man who'd delivered unpleasant news without having to deal with the emotional aftermath. Victoria didn't appear in the kitchen for nearly an hour. When she finally did, her composure was back in place, but Rex noticed how her hands shook slightly as she began preparing supper. The foreclosure notice lay folded on the kitchen table, its official seal catching the afternoon light like an accusation. "Mrs. Meadows," Rex said carefully, "that notice on the table, is there anything I should know about?" Victoria's back stiffened, but she didn't turn around from the stove where she was stirring a pot of stew. For a long moment, the only sound in the kitchen was the soft bubbling of the meal and the tick of the clock on the wall. "I suppose you heard," she said finally. "Couldn't help but overhear some of it. 3 months behind on payments?" Victoria set down her spoon and turned to face him, her chin raised in a gesture Rex was beginning to recognize as her way of gathering courage. "Yes, the inn hasn't been profitable for over a year. I've been using my savings to keep current, but—" she gestured helplessly. "Savings don't last forever." Rex studied the foreclosure notice without touching it. The bank's terms were clearly stated: bring all payments current by September 30th or face losing the property. It was the kind of document that destroyed lives with bureaucratic efficiency. "Why didn't you mention this when you offered me the job? Would you have taken it if you'd known?" The question hung in the air between them. Rex considered his answer carefully, because he suspected Victoria's future, and now his own, might depend on his honesty. "Probably not," he admitted. "Would have felt too much like charity." "And now?" Rex looked around the kitchen, taking in the clean surfaces, the well-organized shelves, the small touches that made the space feel like a home rather than just a business. Through the doorway, he could see into the dining room where 3 travelers were enjoying their meals, talking quietly among themselves. The inn was a good place, well-run and welcoming. It deserved a chance to survive. "Now I'm thinking we both need this to work," he said. "Question is, what can we do about it?" Victoria's smile was tremulous but genuine. "I was hoping you might have some ideas. I've run out of my own." Rex picked up the foreclosure notice and read it thoroughly, his mind already working through possibilities. 3 months wasn't much time, but it wasn't impossible either. The inn had good bones and a solid reputation. What it needed was someone who understood how to make it profitable, not just respectable. "First thing we need to do is figure out exactly how much you need to raise. Then we can work backward from there." $2,300, Victoria said quietly. "That's what I need to bring everything current." Rex whistled softly. It was a substantial sum, more than most ranch hands made in 2 years. But it wasn't impossible, not if they were smart about it and willing to work harder than either of them had ever worked before. "All right then," he said, folding the notice and handing it back to her. "I guess we better get started." Victoria's eyes searched his face, as if looking for signs of doubt or regret. Whatever she saw there seemed to reassure her, because her shoulders relaxed and her smile became more confident. "We're really going to try to save it." "Ma'am, I've spent my whole life working other people's land and building other people's dreams. This is the first time in years someone's asked me to help save something instead of just maintain it." Rex met her gaze steadily. "Yes, we're going to try to save it." As the sun set over Copper Ridge that evening, Rex sat on the inn's front porch, planning repairs and calculating costs, while Victoria worked in the kitchen preparing for the next day. The town was settling into its evening rhythm, but inside the Meadows Inn, 2 people who had been strangers that morning were now partners in an enterprise that would either save them both or ruin them together. The foreclosure notice lay on Victoria's kitchen table like a challenge, but for the first time since receiving it, she wasn't facing that challenge alone. Rex began each morning before dawn, moving through the inn's rooms and hallways with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood that time was a luxury they couldn't afford. 3 months to raise $2,300 meant every day mattered. Every repair completed was a step toward survival, and every dollar saved was a victory worth celebrating. It was while cleaning out the inn's storage room that he found the branding iron. The tool was tucked behind a stack of moth-eaten blankets, its metal surface dulled by years of neglect, but still bearing the distinctive D mark that made Rex's breath catch in his throat. He lifted it with hands that trembled slightly, turning it toward the morning light that filtered through the storage room's single window. "Dalton," he whispered, tracing the raised letter with one finger. The brand was identical to the one his Father had used on their small ranch 40 miles north of Copper Ridge. Rex could still remember the acrid smell of burning hair and hide, the way the cattle would bellow and dance away from the iron's heat. The pride in his father's voice when he explained that every rancher worth his salt needed a mark that meant something. "That there's our name burned into history, son," his father had said. "Long after we're gone, that mark will still mean something. It says these animals belong to people who took care of what was theirs." Rex had been 12 then, old enough to understand the weight of legacy, but too young to appreciate how quickly it could all disappear. The drought of '93 had lasted 2 years, long enough to kill their cattle and force the sale of their land to pay debts that had accumulated like winter snow, slowly at first, then all at once. His father had died that winter, some said of pneumonia. But Rex knew better. A man could die of a broken heart just as surely as any disease. "Mr. Dalton, are you all right?" Victoria's voice startled him back to the present. She stood in the storage room doorway, concern written across her features as she took in his expression and the branding iron in his hands. "I'm fine, ma'am. Just this caught me by surprise." Victoria stepped into the room, her gaze moving from Rex's face to the iron and back again. "That was my husband's. He bought it from a rancher north of town who was selling out. I never knew what the letter stood for." "Dalton," Rex said quietly. "It belonged to my father." Understanding dawned in Victoria's eyes, followed by something. "That might have been pain. Your family's ranch, the one you lost." Rex nodded, unable to trust his voice. He'd thought he'd made peace with the past, accepted that some losses were permanent and couldn't be undone. But holding this piece of his heritage, this tangible connection to the man who'd taught him everything he knew about honest work and treating people fairly, brought back a flood of memories he'd spent decades trying to forget. "I'm sorry," Victoria said softly. "I had no idea, no reason you should have. It was a long time ago, but even as Rex said the words, he knew they weren't entirely true. Time might dull the sharp edges of grief, but it didn't erase the fundamental sense of loss that came from watching everything your family had built disappear because of circumstances beyond anyone's control. The drought, the banknotes, the forced sale, it had all happened to other people. People he'd read about in newspapers or heard discussed, in hushed conversations at church socials, until it happened to him. "What will you do with it?" Victoria asked. Rex considered the question, turning the iron over in his hands. The practical thing would be to set it aside, maybe eventually sell it to someone who could put it to use. But practicality had never been his strongest suit when it came to family memories. "Keep it, I suppose. Don't have much left of my father's legacy. This seems worth holding on to." Victoria was quiet for a moment, and Rex could see her wrestling with something. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note of determination that he'd learned to associate with her more difficult decisions. "Keep it where you can see it," she said. "Legacy isn't just about what we inherit. Sometimes it's about what we build with the pieces that remain." The words hit Rex with unexpected force. He'd spent so many years focusing on what had been lost, the ranch, the cattle, the future he'd planned, that he'd never considered what might still be possible with what remained. He had his father's work ethic, his understanding of the land, his ability to see what needed doing and find a way to do it. Maybe that was legacy enough. That afternoon, while Victoria managed the dining room during the busy lunch hour, Rex began implementing the first phase of their plan to increase the inn's revenue. The stable behind the inn had been used primarily for storage since Victoria's husband died, but Rex could see its potential as a source of income. Travelers often needed a place to stable their horses, and many would pay extra for feed and grooming services. He was mucking out the first stall when he heard voices from the inn's kitchen. Victoria speaking with someone whose tone carried the particular combination of authority and condescension that usually belonged to men accustomed to getting their way without argument. "Understand your situation, Mrs. Meadows, but the talk around town has people concerned." Rex recognized the voice as belonging to Reverend Morrison, the town's Methodist minister and Tom Morrison's older brother. The Reverend had always struck Rex as a man who confused moral authority with social control, the kind of person who genuinely believed his disapproval carried the weight of divine judgment. "I am not sure I understand what you mean, Reverend," Victoria replied, her voice carefully neutral. "A single woman taking in a man of uncertain prospects. You must understand how it appears to those of us concerned with proper moral standards." Rex felt anger flare in his chest, hot and sudden. He'd expected gossip. Small towns thrived on speculation about their neighbor's business, but he hadn't anticipated a direct confrontation about the supposed impropriety of their arrangement. "Mr. Dalton is an employee," Victoria said firmly. "Nothing more, nothing less. I fail to see how providing honest work to a man of good character could be construed as improper. Nevertheless, appearances matter. Perhaps it would be better if Mr. Dalton found accommodation elsewhere. I'm sure we could arrange something at the boarding house. That won't be necessary." Victoria's voice had taken on a steel edge that Rex had never heard before. Through the kitchen window, he could see her standing with her spine straight and her chin raised, facing down the minister with the kind of quiet authority that brooked no argument. "Mr. Dalton's accommodation is part of his employment agreement. Unless you're prepared to match his wages and provide him with alternative work, I suggest you focus your moral concerns on matters that actually require your intervention." Reverend Morrison sputtered something about Christian duty and community standards, but Victoria had clearly dismissed him from consideration. Rex watched through the window as she turned her attention to preparing vegetables for supper, her movements sharp and efficient in a way that suggested she was working off anger. After the minister left, Rex found Victoria in the kitchen, her face flushed with indignation and her hands moving with unnecessary force as she chopped onions. "You didn't have to defend me like that," he said quietly. Victoria looked up from her cutting board, her eyes bright with unshed tears that might have been from the onions or from frustration. "Yes, I did. Reverend Morrison and his ilk seem to think that a woman's reputation is more fragile than spun glass, while a man's is apparently indestructible. I won't have you driven away by small-minded gossip." Rex felt something shift in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the kitchen's heat. It had been years since anyone had stood up for him, longer still since someone had done so with such fierce conviction. "All the same, I appreciate it. Not many people would have taken that stand." Victoria's smile was small but genuine. "Then perhaps they should learn better. Now help me finish these vegetables. We have paying customers to feed, and that's more important than what the town busybodies think about our business arrangements." As they worked side by side in the kitchen, Rex found himself thinking about legacy again. His father's branding iron sat on the shelf above the stove, its familiar weight a reminder of what had been lost. But here, in this kitchen, with this woman who understood something about fighting for what mattered, he was beginning to understand that legacy might be less about preserving the past and more about building something worth preserving for the future. Victoria's recipe collection occupied an entire drawer in the kitchen, dozens of cards written in a careful hand that spoke of patience and attention to detail. Rex discovered them by accident while searching for a spare dish rag, but once he saw them, he found himself studying the careful notations and modifications that marked each card. "Apple pie with extra cinnamon for cold evenings," read one notation. "Beef stew. Reduce salt for Mr. Henderson's condition," advised another. Each recipe told a story of consideration, of someone who cooked not just to fill stomachs, but to provide comfort and care. "Those were my mother's," Victoria said, appearing beside him with the quiet grace that had become familiar over the past 2 weeks. "She insisted I copy them all before I married, said a woman who couldn't cook properly would never truly make a home." Rex carefully closed the drawer, aware that he'd been intruding on something deeply personal. She sounds like a wise woman, she was, though I'm not sure she ever imagined I'd be using her recipes to feed traveling salesmen and cattle buyers in a Texas frontier town. There was no bitterness in Victoria's voice, only a kind of wistful acceptance that suggested she'd made peace with how far her life had strayed from her mother's expectations. Rex found himself curious about that journey, about what had brought a woman of obvious refinement to Copper Ridge, and what kept her here despite the financial struggles and social isolation. "Where did you learn to run an inn?" he asked. Victoria smiled, moving to the stove where a pot of coffee was warming. "Trial and error, mostly. My husband had grand plans when we bought this place. He was going to modernize it, expand the dining room, maybe add another floor for more guest rooms." She poured coffee into 2 cups, adding sugar to both without asking how Rex preferred his. She'd noticed his habits over their shared meals, the same way she'd noticed that he favored his left shoulder after a long day of work and always hung his hat on the same peg by the kitchen door. What happened to those plans? He died before. We could implement most of them. Heart attack in his sleep, just 6 months after we arrived in Copper Ridge. Victoria's voice remained steady, but Rex caught the slight pause before she continued. "I suppose I could have sold the place and returned east, but—" She shrugged. "This was our dream. Giving up felt like abandoning him all over again." Rex accepted the coffee gratefully, noting how Victoria had remembered that he took his black butt with extra sugar. It was a small consideration, but one that spoke to her attention to the people around her. No wonder the inn's regular customers were genuinely fond of her, rather than simply tolerant. 3 years is a long time to carry someone else's dream, he observed carefully. Victoria's laugh held no humor. "Is it? How long did you carry your father's dream before circumstances forced you to let it go?" The question hit Rex squarely, forcing him to consider parallels he'd been avoiding. How many years had he spent trying to be the rancher his father had raised him to become, even after it became clear that the world no longer had room for small, independent operations? How many opportunities had he passed by because they didn't fit the vision his father had painted of a life well lived? "Too long, probably," he admitted. They drank their coffee in comfortable silence, each lost in thoughts about roads not taken and futures that had seemed certain until they weren't. Outside, the afternoon was building toward evening, and soon the dining room would fill with the inn's regular customers, expecting their usual excellent meal and attentive service. "I've been thinking about ways to increase revenue," Rex said. "Eventually. The stable repairs are nearly finished, and I think we could start advertising boarding services. But there might be other possibilities too." Victoria set down her cup, giving him her full attention. Over the past 2 weeks, she'd learned to trust Rex's practical judgment about improvements and repairs. His suggestions were always thoughtful and realistic, based on careful observation rather than wishful thinking. "What did you have in mind?" "Well, you're the best cook in town, but most people only experience your food if they're staying at the inn or eating in the dining room." "What if we started offering prepared meals for families? Sunday dinners for widowers who can't cook, special occasion meals for people who want something finer than they can manage at home?" Victoria considered this, her expression thoughtful. It would mean more work. Everything worth doing means more work. Question is whether the additional income would justify the effort. "And you'd be willing to help with the additional work?" Rex met her gaze steadily. "Ma'am, I've got nowhere else to be, and nothing more important to do than help you save this. A place. If that means I spend my evenings delivering meals or my Sundays helping you cook for half the town, that's time well spent." Victoria's smile was soft but genuine. "You realize people will talk even more if we start working together so closely. Let them talk. Talk never killed anyone. And it might even bring us customers. Nothing advertises good food like people discussing it, even if they're gossiping while they do it." That evening, as they prepared supper for the inn's guests, Rex found himself watching Victoria move through the kitchen with practiced efficiency. She seasoned dishes without measuring, adjusted cooking times based on the weather and the particular cuts of meat she was using, and somehow managed to produce meals that were both consistent and memorable. "You really are an exceptional cook," he said, as she plated the evening's roast beef with vegetables. Victoria paused in her work, a flush rising in her cheeks. "Thank you. That means more coming from someone who's eaten as many meals as you have." "Mean it. This isn't just good food. It's the kind of cooking that makes people feel cared for. That's a rare gift." Victoria's hands stilled completely, and when she looked at him, Rex saw something vulnerable in her expression. "My mother used to say that cooking was the closest thing to magic most people ever experienced. Taking simple ingredients and transforming them into something that brings comfort and joy. Your mother was right. She also said that a meal prepared with love could heal more than medicine and hurt feelings." Victoria's voice grew softer. "I haven't cooked for someone who truly appreciated it in longer than I care to admit." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning that went beyond compliments about seasoning and technique. Rex felt something shift in the space they shared, an acknowledgement of the growing connection that had developed through shared work and common purpose. "Well," he said carefully, "you're cooking for someone who appreciates it now." Victoria's smile was radiant. "Yes, I suppose I am." As the evening progressed and they served dinner to the inn's guests, Rex noticed how Victoria's entire demeanor had brightened. She moved with more confidence, spoke with more warmth to the customers, and seemed to take genuine pleasure in their compliments about the meal. Later, after the dishes were washed and the inn had settled into its nighttime quiet, Rex found Victoria sitting on the front porch, looking out at the stars beginning to appear over Copper Ridge. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, settling into the chair beside her. "I was thinking about what you said earlier, about carrying other people's dreams." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "I think I've been so focused on preserving my husband's vision for this place that I forgot I might have my own ideas about what it could become. And what would those ideas look like?" Victoria turned to face him, her eyes bright with possibilities she was just beginning to consider. "I think they might look very much like what we're building together." Rex felt his heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with the work they'd been doing, and everything to do with the woman sitting beside him in the gathering darkness. For the first time in years, he was part of something that felt like it might actually have a future. Victoria found the letter while cleaning out her late husband's desk, a task she'd been postponing for 3 years, but could no longer avoid as they searched for every possible financial document that might help their situation. It was tucked between the pages of a ledger book, the paper yellowed with age, and the ink faded, but still legible enough to make her hands shake as she read. "My dearest Margaret," the letter began, addressed to a woman whose name Victoria had never heard. "I know this arrangement with Victoria serves our purposes well, but I find myself longing for the day when I can abandon this pretense and return to you and our life together." Victoria sank into the desk chair, the letter trembling in her grip as she continued reading. Each line revealed a truth that reframed her entire marriage, her understanding of the man she'd mourned, and the foundation upon which she'd built. Her life in Copper Ridge, the marriage had been a business arrangement. Her husband had needed a respectable wife to establish himself in Texas society, and Victoria, recently orphaned and facing financial ruin after her father's business failed, had needed security and a fresh start far from the whispers and bankruptcy, proceedings that had destroyed her family's reputation in Philadelphia. But while Victoria had gradually come to love the man she'd married, believing their shared dreams and quiet affection had grown into something genuine. Her husband had apparently never stopped planning his return to the woman he'd left behind in Chicago, the woman he'd never mentioned, the woman whose existence turned Victoria's entire married life into an elaborate deception. "Victoria." I heard. Rex's voice stopped abruptly as he appeared in the doorway, taking in her expression and the letter in her hands. "What's wrong?" Victoria tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. How could she explain that everything she'd believed about her marriage, about the love that had motivated her to stay in Copper Ridge and fight for their shared dream, had been built on lies? How could she admit that she'd spent 3 years mourning a man who had never truly been hers? Rex crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, his presence solid and reassuring, even as her world tilted off its axis. "Victoria, talk to me. He didn't love me," she whispered, the words barely audible. "My husband. He was planning to leave me, to return to another woman." Rex's expression darkened as he took in the letter, though Victoria noticed he made no move to read it without her permission. "May I?" Victoria nodded, unable to speak as Rex carefully read the letter that had shattered her understanding of her own life. She watched his face as he processed the contents, saw the anger that flashed in his eyes, not at her, she realized, but on her behalf. "When was this written?" Rex asked quietly. Victoria checked the date with trembling fingers. 2 months before he died. He was planning to tell me after harvest season, said it would be easier for me to make arrangements if I had time to prepare. The clinical language of her husband's betrayal cut deeper than any passionate confession might have. He'd been planning to discard her with the same careful consideration he'd used to plan their business ventures, treating their marriage as just another contract to be terminated when it no longer served his purposes. Rex set the letter aside and took Victoria's hands in his calloused fingers warm and steady against her trembling ones. "I'm sorry. This is a hell of a thing to discover. I've spent 3 years fighting to preserve his dream," Victoria said, her voice growing stronger as anger began to compete with hurt. 3 years trying to honor a man who was planning to abandon me. 3 years mourning someone who never truly existed. "The inn exists," Rex said firmly. "Your work here, the life you've built, the people you've helped, that's all real. That's all yours. Don't let his deception take that away from you." Victoria looked around the office that had been her husband's private space, seeing it now with different eyes. The neat ledgers, the carefully filed correspondence, the business records that painted a picture of a man building something permanent. All of it had been temporary in his mind, a way station on his journey back to his real life. "I don't know who I am if I'm not his widow," she admitted. "That's been my identity here for 3 years, the respectable widow trying to honor her husband's memory." Rex was quiet for a long moment, still holding her hands as he considered his words. "You're Victoria Meadows. You're the woman who took a failing inn and turned it into the best place to eat and sleep within 50 miles. You're the woman who saw a discarded cowboy and gave him a chance to prove his worth. You're the woman who stands up to pompous ministers and small-minded gossips because you believe in doing what's right." His words were simple, but they carried a conviction that made Victoria's heart clench. Rex saw her, not as her husband's widow, not as the polished Eastern lady playing at frontier life, but as herself, the woman she'd become through 3 years of struggle and determination. Those things feel so small compared to... She gestured helplessly at the letter. "They're not small. They're who you really are, without any pretense or deception. That man," Rex's voice hardened slightly, "he was a fool. He had something precious, and he was too blind or too selfish to recognize it." Victoria felt tears. She hadn't allowed herself to shed for 3 years, finally beginning to fall. But they weren't tears of grief anymore. They were tears of anger and relief, and something that might have been hope. "I don't know how to stop loving someone who never really existed," she whispered. "Maybe you don't stop. Maybe you just start loving someone who does exist, someone who sees you for exactly who you are and wouldn't change a thing about it." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility and promise. Victoria looked at Rex, really looked at him, seeing not just the reliable handyman who'd become her business partner, but the man who'd somehow seen through her careful facades to the woman underneath. The man who'd defended her against gossip, worked beside her through long days and longer evenings, and somehow made her feel more herself than she'd felt in years. "Rex, I know this is complicated," he said quickly. "I know you're dealing with a lot right now, and the last thing you need is more pressure. But I want you to know you deserve to be loved for who you are, not used for what you can provide. You deserve someone who sees your strength and your kindness and your courage and counts himself lucky to be part of your life." Victoria's heart was racing now, but not with the panic she'd felt reading her husband's letter. This was different, anticipation mixed with fear, hope tempered by uncertainty. Rex was offering her something she'd never actually had, the chance to be loved without pretense, without conditions, without the need to be anyone other than herself. "The timing is terrible," she said softly. Rex's smile was gentle. "I've never been accused of having good timing, but I've also never been one to let perfect timing stop me from saying what needs to be said." Victoria found herself smiling through her tears. "We're trying to save my inn. The town is already gossiping about our arrangement. I've just discovered my entire marriage was a lie, and you choose now to what? To tell you that working beside you these past weeks has been the best part of my day. To admit that I look forward to our evening conversations more than anything else in my life. To say that watching you stand up to that pompous minister made me prouder than I've ever been of anyone." Victoria's breath caught. No one had ever spoken to her with such direct honesty, such complete absence of calculation or hidden agenda. Rex was offering her his heart with the same straightforward competence he brought to everything else. No games, no deception, just truth laid bare. "The inn," she started, "will be saved or lost based on our work and determination, not on whatever this is between us. I'm not going anywhere, Victoria. Whether you can return my feelings or not, I'm here until we've fought this battle together." Victoria stood slowly, the letter falling forgotten to the floor as she faced Rex fully. He rose with her, his hands still gentle on hers, his eyes steady and patient as he waited for her response. "I'm not sure I know how to trust my feelings anymore," she admitted. "Then don't trust them yet. Just don't close the door on the possibility that maybe, someday, you might be willing to try." Victoria nodded, unable to speak past the emotion, clogging her throat. The future she'd been fighting to preserve, the widow's life dedicated to her late husband's memory, lay in ruins around her. But standing here with Rex, she found herself imagining a different future entirely. One built on truth instead of deception, on partnership instead of obligation, on love that saw her clearly and chose her anyway. It was terrifying and exhilarating and completely different from anything she'd ever dared to hope for. And for the first time since finding that letter, Victoria thought it might actually be worth fighting for. The medal lay wrapped in faded cloth at the bottom of Rex's saddlebags, a bronze star dulled by time, but still bearing the inscription that had once filled him with pride. "For valor in service to the Union." Rex hadn't looked at it in years, hadn't spoken of his military service to anyone in Copper Ridge, but Victoria's courage in facing the truth about her marriage had awakened something in him that demanded equal honesty. He found her in the kitchen early the next morning, her movements efficient but subdued as she prepared breakfast for the inn's guests. The previous day's revelations hung between them like morning fog, not uncomfortable, but present, changing the way they saw everything familiar. "Victoria," he said quietly, not wanting to startle her, "there are things about my past I should have told you. Things you have a right to know if we're going to—" He paused, uncertain how to name what was growing between them. Victoria set down her mixing spoon and turned to face him, her expression open but guarded. "You don't owe me your secrets, Rex. We all have parts of our lives we'd rather not revisit. Maybe not owe, but want to share. Yesterday you showed me who you really are underneath all the pretense. I'd like to do the same." Rex reached into his pocket and withdrew the medal, its weight familiar, despite the years since he'd last held it. Victoria's eyes widened as she took in the military decoration, her gaze moving from the bronze star to his face with new understanding. "You were a soldier, captain in the 3rd Colorado Volunteers during the Indian campaigns, spent 6 years fighting in places most people have never heard of, for reasons that seemed important at the time. Rex's voice carried no pride, only the weary acceptance of a man who'd seen too much and carried the weight of it ever since. Victoria accepted the medal when he offered it, turning it over in her hands with the careful reverence she might have shown a religious artifact. "This is for valor. What did you do?" Rex was quiet for a long moment, remembering a winter morning in the Colorado Territory when everything had gone wrong and right simultaneously. "My unit was escorting supply wagons to Fort Collins when we were ambushed. The lieutenant was killed in the first volley, and the men were pinned down with no clear escape route. Someone had to take charge. Someone had to make the hard decisions. And that someone was you. I got the men out, cost us the supply train, but everyone went home to their families. The army called it valor, but it felt like doing what had to be done to keep people alive." Victoria traced the inscription with one finger, her touch gentle on the worn bronze. "Is that why you left the military? After 6 years?" Rex's laugh held no humor. "I left because I realized I was better at keeping people alive than I was at the business of war. Killing became too easy, and that scared me more than any enemy fire ever did." The admission hung in the morning air between them, heavy with implications. Rex had never spoken those words aloud before, had barely allowed himself to think them. But something about Victoria's quiet attention made honesty feel possible. "I came back to Texas, determined to build something instead of destroying it. Worked ranches, raised cattle, tried to use my hands for growing instead of—" He gestured, helplessly. "Well, instead of other things. Is that why you're so good at managing difficult situations? The way you handled that drunk cowboy last week? Or how you knew exactly what to say when the Pemberton boy was causing trouble in the dining room?" Rex nodded slowly. "Military training teaches you to read people, to understand when situations are about to turn dangerous and how to defuse them before anyone gets hurt. I suppose those skills transfer to keeping peace in an inn as well as they do to keeping soldiers alive." Victoria was quiet for several minutes, still holding the medal as she processed this new understanding of the man who'd become so central to her life. When she spoke, her voice was thoughtful rather than surprised. "It explains a lot about who you are. The way you take charge without being domineering, how you can be gentle with frightened horses but firm with men who need boundaries. You've spent your life protecting people, and you've spent yours taking care of people," Rex replied. "Maybe that's why this works. Us working together, I mean. We both understand what it means to put others first." Before Victoria could respond, raised voices from the inn's front parlor interrupted their conversation. Rex recognized Arthur Pemberton's pompous tones, but there was another voice as well, younger, more aggressive, with the kind of edge that suggested trouble was brewing. "Tired of hearing excuses, Mrs. Meadows. The bank has been more than patient, but patience has its limits." Rex and Victoria exchanged glances before moving toward the parlor, where they found Pemberton accompanied by a younger man Rex didn't recognize. The stranger was well-dressed, but carried himself with the kind of aggressive confidence that usually meant he was used to getting his way through intimidation rather than reason. "Mr. Pemberton," Victoria said calmly, "I wasn't expecting you. Today, Mrs. Meadows, I'd like you to meet my nephew, Charles Pemberton. He's recently arrived from Denver to help me assess some of the bank's more challenging accounts." Charles Pemberton looked Victoria up and down with calculating eyes that made Rex's hands clench involuntarily. The younger man had the bearing of someone who saw other people's problems as opportunities for personal gain. "Mrs. Meadows," Charles said, his tone patronizing, "Uncle Arthur has explained your situation. I'm here to discuss some alternatives to foreclosure that might benefit everyone involved." "What kind of alternatives?" Victoria asked, though Rex could hear the wariness in her voice. "Well, the inn is a valuable property, but perhaps it's simply too much for a woman to manage alone. I represent several investors who might be interested in purchasing the property at a fair price, allowing you to relocate somewhere more suitable to your circumstances." Rex felt anger flare in his chest, recognizing the barely concealed condescension in the man's offer. This wasn't about helping Victoria. It was about acquiring valuable property at below-market prices by taking advantage of her financial difficulties. "That's very generous," Victoria replied, her voice carefully neutral, "but I'm not interested in selling." Charles's smile never wavered, but something predatory flickered in his eyes. "Perhaps you should consider your options more carefully. A woman in your position, alone, struggling financially, with questionable associations," his gaze flicked meaningfully toward Rex, "might find that opportunities for graceful exits become increasingly rare." The threat was subtle but unmistakable, and Rex felt his military training kick in as he assessed the situation. Charles Pemberton wasn't just making an offer, he was applying pressure, using Victoria's vulnerability and the town's gossip as weapons to force her compliance. "I think you gentlemen should leave," Rex said quietly, stepping slightly forward so that his presence became impossible to ignore. Charles turned his attention to Rex for the first time, taking in his size and bearing with the calculating gaze of a man trying to determine whether he was facing a threat or an obstacle. "And you are?" "Rex Dalton, Mrs. Meadows' business partner." "Ah, yes, the displaced ranch hand. Uncle Arthur mentioned you." Charles's tone carried dismissive amusement. "I'm sure you mean well, but this conversation involves financial matters that are beyond your experience." Rex's smile was cold. "My experience includes 6 years as a cavalry officer, dealing with men who thought intimidation was a substitute for honest negotiation. I learned to recognize bullies pretty quickly, and I learned effective ways to discourage them." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as Charles processed Rex's quiet threat. Arthur Pemberton cleared his throat nervously, clearly recognizing that the situation was escalating beyond his comfort level. "Now, gentlemen, let's keep this civil." "It will stay civil as long as everyone remembers their manners," Rex said, his gaze never leaving Charles's face. "Mrs. Meadows has made her position clear. I suggest you respect it." Charles studied Rex for a long moment, and Rex could see him weighing options, calculating whether this was a battle worth fighting. Finally, the younger man's aggressive smile returned, but it no longer reached his eyes. "Of course, we wouldn't want to pressure anyone into making hasty decisions." He turned back to Victoria. "But Mrs. Meadows, I do hope you'll consider our offer seriously. Opportunities like this don't come along often, and it would be unfortunate if pride prevented you from making a practical choice." After the Pembertons left, Rex and Victoria stood in the parlor's sudden quiet, both processing what had just occurred. "That wasn't just a business offer," Victoria said finally. "No, that was a man used to getting what he wants by making people afraid of what happens if they refuse." Rex's voice carried the hard edge of experience. "Charles Pemberton is going to be a problem." Victoria nodded, her expression thoughtful rather than frightened. "Then I suppose it's fortunate that I have a partner who knows how to handle problems." Rex felt something warm expand in his chest at her words. Partner, not employee, not hired help, but partner. Someone she trusted to stand beside her when trouble came calling. "We'll face whatever comes together," he promised. "Together, Victoria." Agreed, and Rex heard in that single word a commitment that went far beyond saving the inn. Victoria found the deed while searching through a wooden box she'd avoided opening for 3 years. It had been her husband's private papers, documents she'd assumed were mundane business records, not worth the painful memories they might trigger. But with foreclosure looming and Charles Pemberton's threats echoing in her mind, she could no longer afford to leave any stone unturned in her search for financial solutions. The deed was folded inside an envelope marked "Mineral Rights Meadows." "Property," in her husband's careful handwriting. Victoria's hands trembled as she unfolded the document, her eyes scanning legal language that seemed too important to be buried in a forgotten box. "Rex," she called, her voice barely above a whisper. "Rex, you need to see this." He appeared in the doorway almost immediately, drawn by the urgency in her tone. Over the past weeks, he'd become attuned to her moods, able to read the subtle shifts in her voice that indicated anything from mild concern to genuine crisis. "What is it?" Victoria held up the deed with shaking hands. "Mineral rights. My husband owned the mineral rights to this entire property, and according to this document, they were never sold or transferred. They should have passed to me when he died." Rex crossed the room quickly, taking the deed from her and studying it with the careful attention he'd learned to apply to any document that might affect their future. His military experience had taught him to read contracts and legal papers, skills that had served him well in various civilian occupations. "This is dated 6 months before your husband died," he said slowly, "and it specifically grants him rights to any coal, oil, or mineral deposits found on the property, extending to a depth of 500 feet and covering 23 acres. But what does it mean? Are there actually minerals here?" Rex was quiet for a moment, his mind working through implications and possibilities. "I don't know, but there's been talk lately about coal deposits throughout this region. That surveyor who came through town last month, he wasn't just mapping for the railroad. Word was he was looking for potential mining sites." Victoria sank into her husband's chair, overwhelmed by this revelation that cast her financial situation in an entirely different light. "If there really are valuable minerals on this property, then you might own something worth considerably more than anyone realize," Rex finished, "including Charles Pemberton and his uncle." The implications hit Victoria like a physical blow. "You think they know? Is that why Charles was so eager to buy the inn?" "It would explain a lot. The timing of their offer, Charles coming all the way from Denver, their insistence on a quick sale." Rex's expression darkened. "If they have knowledge about mineral deposits on your land, their pressure to force foreclosure starts looking less like business and more like fraud." Victoria stood abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the inn's back garden. The same land that she'd been fighting to save, that had seemed like such a modest legacy, might actually represent wealth beyond anything she'd imagined. But the discovery also brought new dangers, new complications that could destroy her as easily as save her. "There's something else," she said quietly. "Something I should have mentioned before," but she turned to face Rex, her expression troubled. "Charles Pemberton wasn't just making business threats yesterday. After you left to check on the stable, he came back alone." Rex's entire demeanor changed, his body going still in the way that suggested barely contained anger. "What did he say?" "He implied that my association with you was damaging my reputation, and that people were beginning to question my moral character. He suggested that if I continued to resist his offer, he might feel compelled to share his concerns about my behavior with the right people in town." "Son of a—" Rex caught himself, but Victoria could see the fury in his eyes. "He threatened to destroy your reputation if you didn't sell." Not in so many words, but the meaning was clear. "He knows that a woman's reputation is fragile in a place like Copper Ridge, and he's willing to use that against me." Rex began pacing, his movements sharp and controlled in the way that suggested military training asserting itself over civilian restraint. "This changes everything. If Charles Pemberton knows about potential mineral wealth on your property, and he's willing to use blackmail and character assassination to acquire it, then we're dealing with someone considerably more dangerous than a simple business opportunist." Victoria finished. "We need help. Legal help, and probably more than we can find in Copper Ridge." Rex stopped pacing and faced her directly. "I have contacts from my military service, men who've gone into law and business in Denver and Colorado Springs. If anyone can help us navigate this situation, it would be them." Victoria felt a flicker of hope mixed with apprehension. "You'd really call on old army connections for this?" "Victoria, if there are valuable mineral deposits on this land, and the Pembertons are trying to steal them from you through fraud and intimidation, this isn't just about saving your inn anymore. This is about preventing a theft that could be worth thousands of dollars." The weight of the situation settled over Victoria like a heavy cloak. She'd thought her biggest challenge was raising enough money to satisfy the bank and save her modest inn. Now she was potentially sitting on mineral wealth that could transform her life, while facing enemies who were willing to use any means necessary to take it from her. What do we do first? Rex's smile was grim, but determined. First, we keep this information strictly between us until we know more. Second, I send a telegram to Major Sullivan. He's practicing law in Denver now, and ask him to investigate what mineral surveys have been conducted in this area recently. Third, we start documenting every interaction with the Pembertons, every threat, every pressure tactic. And fourth, we prepare for the possibility that this is going to get considerably worse before it gets better. If Charles Pemberton is willing to threaten your reputation over a simple business transaction, there's no telling what he might do when he realizes you've discovered the mineral rights. Victoria nodded, feeling simultaneously terrified and exhilarated. The modest life she'd been fighting to preserve was disappearing, replaced by something larger and more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. But looking at Rex, seeing the determination in his eyes and the protective stance that had become so familiar, she realized she wasn't facing this alone. "There's something else," she said, her voice growing stronger. "If we're going to fight this battle, if we're going to take on the Pembertons and whatever resources they can bring to bear, then we need to be completely honest with each other about everything." Rex nodded. "Agreed. Then I need you to know what you said yesterday, about your feelings, about wanting to be part of my life. I need you to know that I want the same thing. Not because of this mineral rights business, not because I need your help, but because somewhere in the middle of fighting to save this inn, I discovered that what I was really fighting to save was the life we've been building together." Rex's expression softened, and Victoria saw something in his eyes that she'd never seen directed at her before. Love without reservation, without calculation, without hidden agendas or secret motivations. It was the look of a man who saw her completely and chose her anyway. "Victoria, I'm not finished," she said, stepping closer to him. "My husband's deception taught me the difference between being wanted for what I can provide and being loved for who I am. You've shown me that difference every day since you arrived here. Whatever comes next, whatever we have to face with the Pembertons or anyone else, I want to face it as more than business partners." Rex reached for her hands, his touch gentle despite the calluses and scars that marked his palms. "Are you sure? This situation is about to become more complicated than either of us imagined. If there really is mineral wealth on this property, people are going to come out of the woodwork trying to claim pieces of it. Your life is about to change in ways we can't predict." Victoria smiled, feeling more certain than she had about anything in years. "Then it's a good thing I won't be facing those changes alone." Rex's answering smile was brilliant, transforming his weathered features and making Victoria understand why she'd been drawn to him from that very first morning when he'd been preparing to leave town. This was a man worth fighting for, worth building a future with, worth taking risks that would have terrified her just weeks ago. "In that case," Rex said, pulling her closer, "I have a confession to make. I've wanted to do this since the day you defended me to that pompous minister." "Do what?" Victoria asked, though she thought she knew. Instead of answering, Rex cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, gentle at first but with growing intensity, as Victoria responded without hesitation. It was a kiss that tasted of possibility and promise, of two people who had found each other in the midst of crisis and discovered something worth preserving. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Victoria rested her forehead against Rex's and smiled. "Well," she said softly, "I suppose that settles the question of what we're fighting for." "I suppose it does," Rex agreed. "Now let's figure out how we're going to win." Outside, the sun was setting over Copper Ridge, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to promise either glory or battle. Victoria no longer cared which it would be, as long as she didn't have to face it alone. Rex found the resignation letter he'd written but never sent tucked between the pages of his father's Bible, where he'd placed it during one of his darkest moments 3 weeks ago. The paper was creased from handling, the ink slightly smudged. From the sweat of his palms, as he'd wrestled with words that had seemed necessary then, but felt like betrayal now. "Dear Mrs. Meadows," the letter began, "by the time you read this, I will have left Copper Ridge. The talk around town about our arrangement has grown beyond what any respectable woman should have to endure, and I will not be the cause of damage to your reputation or your business." He'd written it the night after Reverend Morrison's visit, when the weight of small-town gossip and his own uncertainty about Victoria's feelings had convinced him that leaving would be the honorable thing to do. The letter went on to explain that he'd completed the most urgent repairs, that she could manage without him, that his presence was causing more harm than good. Now, reading those words while Victoria slept in her room above the kitchen, Rex felt ashamed of his moment of weakness. The man who had written this letter was the same man who had spent 30 years drifting from job to job, never quite belonging anywhere, always ready to move on when circumstances became difficult. But that man had never had anything worth staying to fight for. A soft knock at his door interrupted his brooding. "Rex, are you awake?" Victoria's voice carried an urgency that had him on his feet immediately. He folded the letter and slipped it into his pocket before opening the door to find her fully dressed, despite the early hour, her face tense with worry. "What's wrong?" Major Sullivan's telegram arrived. "The news isn't good." Rex followed Victoria to the kitchen, where a yellow telegraph paper lay on the table beside a cup of coffee that had grown cold while she waited for him to wake. The message was brief, but devastating in its implications. Mineral surveys conducted throughout region. Stop significant coal deposits confirmed on multiple properties. Stop Pemberton family has been acquiring mineral rights through foreclosure and forced sales. Stop legal challenges to their methods ongoing. Stop advise extreme caution. Stop will arrive Friday with documentation. Stop Sullivan. Rex read the telegram twice before its full meaning sank in. They've done this before. The foreclosures, the pressure tactics, the character assassination. It's all part of a systematic plan to acquire mineral-rich properties. Victoria nodded, her expression grim, and we walked right into it. My financial troubles, the inns, location, even the timing of Charles Pemberton's arrival, none of it was coincidence. "How many families have they destroyed?" Rex asked, anger building in his chest. "How many people have lost their homes and land because the Pembertons knew something they didn't?" According to Major Sullivan's previous telegram, at least a dozen. Properties in the past 2 years. Farms, ranches, small businesses, all foreclosed on or sold under pressure, all later revealed to have valuable mineral deposits. Rex began pacing the kitchen, his military training asserting itself as he considered their tactical situation. They were outnumbered, outfinanced, and facing opponents who had both legal resources and no apparent moral constraints. But they also had advantages the Pembertons didn't know about. Knowledge of the fraud, documentation of threats, and allies who understood how to fight this kind of battle. "When is Sullivan arriving?" "Friday morning, 3 days from now." "And when is Arthur Pemberton expecting your final answer about the foreclosure?" Victoria's smile held no warmth. "Also Friday morning. Charles made a point of stopping by yesterday while you were in town to remind me that their generous offer has an expiration date." Rex stopped pacing and faced Victoria directly. "Then we need to be ready for them. Sullivan's documentation will help, but we also need evidence of their threats and intimidation tactics. Written proof that they've been using illegal methods to force people off their land. How do we get that kind of proof? We make them give it to us. Charles Pemberton is arrogant and used to getting his way through bullying. If we can get him to make his threats explicitly in front of witnesses, you want to provoke him into revealing himself," Victoria said, understanding immediately. "But that's dangerous. If he realizes we know about the mineral rights, he might do something. Desperate, yes. But right now, We're fighting a battle we can't win because we don't have the weapons we need. Sometimes you have to take risks to change the terms of engagement." Victoria was quiet for several minutes, considering the implications of what Rex was suggesting. When she spoke, her voice carried the steel he'd come to associate with her most difficult decisions. "What do you need me to do?" Rex felt his chest tighten with a mixture of pride and terror. Victoria was willing to put herself at risk to fight, for what was right, but the thought of her facing Charles Pemberton's threats made every protective instinct he'd developed over 30 years of hard living scream in protest. "Actually, there's something I should tell you first, something that might change how you feel about taking this kind of risk." Rex pulled the resignation letter from his pocket, unfolding it with hands that weren't quite steady. Victoria's eyes widened as she recognized his handwriting. "You were going to leave 3 weeks ago, when the gossip was at its worst, and I didn't know how you felt about us. I convinced myself that staying was selfish, that I was hurting you more than helping." Victoria took the letter from him, reading it with the same careful attention she'd given to her husband's correspondence. But her expression wasn't hurt or angry. It was understanding, tinged with something that might have been regret. "You were trying to protect me. I was being a coward. I've spent most of my adult life running from difficult situations instead of fighting for what mattered. When things got complicated here, my first instinct was to do the same thing, pack my bags and disappear, rather than risk making things worse." Victoria folded the letter carefully and handed it back to him. "But you didn't leave." "No, because for the first time in my life, I found something worth staying to fight for. Someone worth staying to fight for." Victoria's smile was soft but determined. "Then let's make sure that fight is worth winning." Over the next 2 days, Rex and Victoria prepared for the confrontation they both knew was coming. Rex used his military contacts to gather additional information about the Pembertons' business practices, while Victoria documented every interaction they'd had with Charles and his uncle, creating a detailed record of threats and pressure tactics. The town's attitude toward their partnership had begun to shift as well, partly due to Victoria's quiet conversations with key community members and partly due to the visible improvements Rex had made to the inn. The property looked better than it had in years. The dining room was consistently full, and even the most conservative townspeople had to admit that Rex's presence had been beneficial rather than scandalous. Mrs. Patterson from the dry goods store stopped by Thursday evening ostensibly to purchase one of Victoria's prepared meals, but actually to offer her support. "I want you to know, Victoria, that not everyone in town believes the nonsense Charles Pemberton has been spreading about you. And Mr. Dalton, some of us remember what real scandal looks like, and this isn't it." Similar conversations occurred throughout the week, as people who had initially been suspicious of the arrangement between a widowed innkeeper and a displaced cowboy began to see it for what it actually was: 2 decent people helping each other through difficult circumstances. Sheriff Hawthorne's visit Thursday night carried more weight than social support, however. The lawman arrived just as Victoria was closing the dining room, his expression serious but not unfriendly. "Victoria, Rex, I wanted to give you both a heads up about something. Charles Pemberton came to see me today with some concerns about threats he claims have been made against him." Rex's expression didn't change, but Victoria could see the tension in his shoulders. "What kind of threats?" "The vague kind that are hard to prove or disprove. But he wanted it on record that he feels intimidated by Rex's military background and what he calls aggressive behavior during their business discussions." "And what did you tell him?" Victoria asked. Sheriff Hawthorne's smile was slight, but genuine. "I told him that in my experience, Mr. Dalton has been nothing but respectful and law-abiding since arriving in Copper Ridge. I also mentioned that making false reports is itself a crime, and that I'd hate to see anyone damage their reputation by making accusations they couldn't support." After the sheriff left, Rex and Victoria sat in the kitchen, reviewing their preparations one final time. Major Sullivan would arrive on the morning train. The Pembertons would undoubtedly make their final push for a forced sale. And everything they'd worked for would be decided in the span of a few hours. "Are you ready for this?" Rex asked. Victoria's answering smile carried no uncertainty. "I've been ready since the day I realized my husband had been planning to abandon me. I'm tired of being manipulated by men who think a woman's desperation makes her easy prey. And after tomorrow, if we win, if we expose the Pembertons' fraud and secure your mineral rights, what then?" Victoria reached across the table and took his hands in hers, her touch warm and steady. "Then we build something together, something honest and permanent, and worth all the fighting we've had to do to protect it." Rex lifted her hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "I love you, Victoria Meadows. Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that. I love you too, Rex Dalton, and tomorrow we're going to make sure the whole town knows it." Outside, a storm was building on the horizon, dark clouds gathering with the promise of either cleansing, rain, or destructive winds. But inside the Meadows Inn, two people who had found each other in the midst of crisis prepared to fight for a future that belonged to them alone. The judge's gavel lay beside a stack of legal documents on the makeshift table that had been set up in the inn's dining room. Judge Harrison Crane had arrived on the same train as Major Sullivan, his weathered face bearing the expression of a man who had presided over too many cases where powerful people tried to use the law as a weapon against the vulnerable. Victoria stood beside Rex in the packed dining room, grateful for his steady presence as they faced what would determine the future of everything they'd built together. The entire town seemed to have crowded into the space, some drawn by curiosity, others by a genuine desire to see justice prevail, and still others by the simple human instinct to witness a showdown between David and Goliath. Arthur Pemberton sat at one table with his nephew Charles and a sharp-faced lawyer who had arrived from Denver that morning. Their confidence was evident in their posture, their expensive clothes, and the dismissive way they glanced around the room as if the proceedings were merely a formality before their inevitable victory. Major Sullivan occupied the table opposite them, his military bearing unchanged despite civilian clothes and 15 years of legal practice. He had arrived with 2 leather satchels full of documentation and the kind of quiet competence that had made him invaluable during Rex's military service. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Crane began, his voice carrying easily through the crowded room, "we are here to resolve a dispute regarding the ownership of mineral rights on the property known as the Meadows Inn. Mrs. Meadows claims ownership of these rights through inheritance from her late husband. The Copper Ridge Bank claims the rights were forfeited when Mrs. Meadows defaulted on her mortgage payments." Charles Pemberton stood, his lawyer beside him. "Your Honor, the bank's position is straightforward. Mrs. Meadows has failed to meet her contractual obligations, and the property, including all mineral rights, should revert to the bank as specified in the original mortgage agreement." "And yet," Judge Crane observed, "there seems to be some question about the bank's knowledge of these mineral rights and their potential value at the time the mortgage was written." "Your Honor," the Denver lawyer interjected smoothly, "the bank's knowledge or lack thereof regarding potential mineral deposits is irrelevant to the legal question at hand. A contract is a contract, regardless of what future developments might reveal about the property's value." Major Sullivan rose from his seat, his movements deliberate and commanding. "If I may, Your Honor, the bank's knowledge is entirely relevant when that knowledge was used to deliberately manipulate Mrs. Meadows into a financial position that would allow them to acquire valuable mineral rights through foreclosure." A murmur ran through the crowd as Sullivan opened his first satchel and withdrew a thick folder. "I have here documentation of similar cases involving the Pemberton family's business practices over the past 3 years. In each case, properties with potential mineral value were acquired through foreclosure or forced sale after the owners encountered sudden financial difficulties." Charles Pemberton's face flushed red. "Those are completely separate matters." "Are they?" Sullivan's voice cut through the objection with military precision, because the pattern suggests otherwise. In every case, mineral surveys were conducted months before foreclosure proceedings began. In every case, the property owners were unaware of their land's potential value. And in every case, the Pemberton family was well positioned to acquire the properties at below-market prices. Judge Crane leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. "Major Sullivan, are you alleging fraud? I am presenting evidence of a systematic pattern of deception and manipulation designed to separate property owners from valuable assets through legal technicalities and financial pressure." Sullivan began laying out documents with the methodical efficiency Rex remembered from their military days. Survey reports dated months before foreclosure proceedings. Correspondence between the Pembertons and mining companies discussing potential coal deposits. Bank records showing suspicious patterns in loan modifications and payment schedules. Furthermore, Sullivan continued, "We have documented evidence of threats and intimidation tactics used against Mrs. Meadows when she initially resisted selling her property." Victoria felt her heart racing as Sullivan produced the written statement she had prepared, detailing every conversation with Charles Pemberton, every veiled threat, every attempt to pressure her into accepting an unfavorable sale. Charles Pemberton shot to his feet. "This is ridiculous. Mrs. Meadows is obviously fabricating these allegations to avoid the consequences of her own financial irresponsibility." "Mr. Pemberton," Judge Crane's voice carried a warning tone, "you will have your opportunity to respond. Please allow Major Sullivan to complete his presentation." Rex watched the faces in the crowd as Sullivan methodically built his case. Mrs. Patterson nodded approvingly as each piece of evidence was revealed. Sheriff Hawthorne took careful notes, his expression growing more serious with each allegation. Even some of the townspeople who had been initially skeptical of Victoria's claims were beginning to look disturbed by the pattern of manipulation Sullivan was revealing. "Your Honor," Sullivan said, reaching for his second satchel, "I also have testimony from property owners in 3 other counties who were victimized by similar schemes. They are prepared to testify that the Pemberton family used identical tactics: financial pressure, character assassination, and legal intimidation to acquire their mineral-rich properties." The Denver lawyer was whispering urgently in Charles Pemberton's ear, but Rex could see the younger man's confidence beginning to crack. The systematic presentation of evidence was revealing not just isolated incidents, but a coordinated campaign of fraud that extended far beyond Copper Ridge. Judge Crane studied the documents Sullivan had presented, his expression growing more grave with each page. When he finally looked up, his gaze fixed on Charles Pemberton with unmistakable suspicion. "Mr. Pemberton, these are serious allegations. Do you wish to respond to the specific charges of fraud and intimidation?" Charles Pemberton stood slowly, his earlier arrogance replaced by barely controlled anger. Rex could see the moment when the younger man made his crucial mistake, the moment when pride and fury overrode prudence and legal counsel. "Your Honor, I refuse to dignify these baseless accusations with a detailed response. Mrs. Meadows is a desperate woman facing financial ruin, and she's clearly willing to make any allegation, no matter how false, to avoid the consequences of her poor business decisions." The words hung in the air like a confession, revealing exactly the kind of dismissive arrogance that had made Charles Pemberton so certain of his victory. But Rex could see that the judge was no longer listening to legal arguments. He was watching a man reveal his true character under pressure. Judge Crane's gavel remained untouched, but his voice carried the weight of final judgment when he spoke. "Mr. Pemberton, your response troubles me more than the allegations themselves. A man falsely accused of fraud typically responds with evidence of his innocence, not attacks on his accuser's character." Victoria's wedding ring had been a source of comfort for 3 years, a tangible connection to the life she thought she had lived and the man she believed she had loved. But now, as Judge Crane prepared to render his verdict, she slipped the gold band from her finger and placed it quietly on the table beside her husband's ring, which she had retrieved from its wooden box that morning. The gesture was small, noticed by few in the crowded dining room, but for Victoria, it represented the final severing of ties to a life built on deception. She was no longer the grieving widow fighting to preserve her husband's legacy. She was Victoria Meadows, standing on her own merits beside the man who had seen her true worth. Rex noticed the movement, his eyes catching hers in a moment of silent understanding. The rings lay side by side on the white tablecloth, symbols of a past that no longer defined her and a future that remained to be written. Judge Crane cleared his throat, commanding the room's attention. After reviewing the evidence presented by both parties, I find myself faced with a clear pattern of fraudulent behavior designed to separate property owners from valuable assets through deception and manipulation. Charles Pemberton's face went pale, but his lawyer placed a restraining hand on his arm before he could voice another outburst. The documentation provided by Major Sullivan demonstrates beyond reasonable doubt that the Pemberton family has engaged in systematic fraud across multiple counties. The mineral surveys, the coordinated foreclosure proceedings, the pattern of intimidation, these are not coincidences or legitimate business practices. Arthur Pemberton finally found his voice. Your Honor, surely you cannot take the word of disgruntled property owners over established businessmen with sterling reputations. Judge Crane's gaze fixed on the older Pemberton with withering intensity. Mr. Pemberton, your reputation is precisely what is in question here. The evidence suggests that you have built your recent prosperity on the systematic theft of other people's property. Victoria felt Rex's hand find hers under the table, his fingers intertwining with hers as they awaited the judge's final decision. Around them, the townspeople sat in rapt attention, understanding that they were witnessing not just a legal proceeding, but a moment that would define what kind of community Copper Ridge would become. Therefore, Judge Crane continued, I find that Mrs. Meadows is the rightful owner of all mineral rights associated with her property, as specified in the deed presented as evidence. Furthermore, I am ordering an immediate investigation into the Pemberton family's business practices, and I am recommending that the Territorial Attorney General review all property acquisitions conducted by this bank over the past 5 years. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent room. Then, as the implications of the judge's ruling sank in, a cheer went up from the assembled townspeople, not the polite applause of a formal gathering, but the genuine celebration of people who had witnessed justice prevail over corruption. Victoria felt tears streaming down her face, but for the first time in years, they were tears of joy rather than grief or frustration. Rex pulled her into his arms, holding her close as the crowd surged around them with congratulations and expressions of support. We did it, she whispered against his chest. We actually did it. You did it, Rex corrected gently. You had the courage to fight when most people would have given up. You trusted the right people and refused to be intimidated by bullies. Charles Pemberton was arguing furiously with his lawyer, his voice carrying clearly through the celebration. This isn't over. We'll appeal this decision, and we'll make sure everyone knows what kind of woman would destroy respectable businessmen with fabricated allegations. Rex released Victoria and turned toward Charles with the kind of cold fury that had once made him effective in combat situations. But before he could speak, Sheriff Hawthorne stepped between them. Mr. Pemberton, the sheriff said quietly, I'd strongly advise you to leave town immediately. Making threats against Mrs. Meadows in front of this many witnesses might constitute intimidation, and I'd hate to have to arrest you for continuing the same behavior that just cost you this case. Major Sullivan approached Victoria and Rex, his satisfaction evident despite his professional composure. Congratulations. This was exactly the kind of case that makes legal work worthwhile. Justice for the deserving and consequences for those who abuse their power. Thank you, Victoria said, her voice thick with emotion. I don't know how we would have managed this without your help. Sullivan's smile was warm. Rex called in a favor, but honestly, Mrs. Meadows, you would have won this case with any competent representation. The evidence was overwhelming, and your courage in documenting their threats made the difference. As the crowd began to disperse and the legal participants gathered their papers, Victoria found herself standing with Rex in the dining room that had become the site of her victory. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny celebrations. So, Rex said, gesturing toward the rings on the table, I notice you made a decision about the past. Victoria picked up her wedding ring and her husband's, holding them both for a moment before tucking them into her apron pocket. Some things are worth preserving as memories, but they don't have to define the future. Rex nodded, understanding perfectly. And what does define the future? Victoria's smile was radiant as she stepped closer to him, her hands finding their way to his chest. The choices we make together, the life we build with honesty instead of deception, the love that sees us clearly and chooses us anyway. In that case, Rex said, pulling her closer, I choose you, Victoria Meadows, today, tomorrow, and for as long as you'll have me. Forever sounds about right, Victoria replied, standing on her toes to kiss the man who had helped her discover her own strength. Outside, Copper Ridge was settling into its evening rhythm. But inside the Meadows Inn, two people who had fought for their right to love each other were finally free to plan a future built on truth. The new sign above the inn's entrance gleamed with fresh paint and gold lettering that caught the morning sun. Dalton Meadows Inn, established 1875. Proprietors, Rex Dalton and Victoria Meadows. 6 months had passed since the legal victory that secured Victoria's mineral rights and exposed the Pemberton's fraud, and the changes to both the inn and its owners were evident to everyone in Copper Ridge. Victoria stood on the front porch, adjusting the sign's position with the careful attention to detail that had always marked her approach to the inn's appearance. But there was a lightness in her movements now, a confidence that spoke of a woman who no longer doubted her place in the world or questioned her worthiness of the good fortune that had finally come her way. Rex emerged from the stable, leading Jasper and a new mare they'd purchased with the first proceeds from the coal mining lease that had been negotiated with a reputable Denver company. The mineral rights that had nearly been stolen from Victoria were now providing a steady income that allowed them to expand the inn's operations and plan for a future that stretched far beyond simple survival. The sign looks perfect, Rex said, pausing to admire Victoria's handiwork, though I still can't quite believe my name is up there beside yours. Victoria's laugh was warm and easy, the sound of someone who had learned to find joy in the present rather than dwelling on past sorrows. You'd better get used to it, Mr. Dalton. We have a wedding to plan, and I intend for that sign to be accurate. In every legal sense, their engagement had been announced 2 months ago, causing exactly the kind of excitement in Copper Ridge that Victoria had once dreaded, but now embraced. The town that had initially viewed their partnership with suspicion now celebrated their love story as proof that good things could happen to people who were brave enough to fight for them. Mrs. Patterson from the dry goods store had appointed herself unofficial wedding coordinator, insisting that the ceremony should be held in the inn's garden with the entire town invited. Sheriff Hawthorne had offered to give Victoria away, a gesture that had moved her to tears and cemented her sense of belonging in the community that had become her true home. Speaking of the wedding, Victoria said, accepting Rex's offered arm. As they walked toward the inn's entrance, Reverend Morrison stopped by yesterday with some interesting news. Rex's expression grew wary. Reverend Morrison had never apologized for his earlier attempts to interfere in their relationship, though he had notably softened his public pronouncements about proper moral conduct since their legal victory. "He's leaving Copper Ridge," Victoria continued, unable to suppress her smile at Rex's obvious relief. Apparently, his brother offered him a position at a larger church in Dallas. "He'll be gone by Christmas. I suppose we should feel charitable about his departure," Rex said diplomatically. "Oh, I do feel charitable. Charitable enough to wish him well in Dallas and hope he learns to mind his own business." They entered the inn together, moving through the dining room where early customers were enjoying Victoria's famous breakfast while discussing the day's plans. The coal mining operation had brought new prosperity to Copper Ridge, creating jobs and attracting the kind of steady, respectable visitors that made innkeeping both profitable and pleasant. In the kitchen, Victoria pulled a letter from her apron pocket, its official-looking envelope bearing the seal of the territorial government. "This arrived yesterday. The investigation into the Pemberton's business practices has concluded." Rex accepted the letter, reading quickly through the legal language the detailed criminal charges filed against Charles Pemberton and the seizure of properties acquired through fraudulent means. Arthur Pemberton had avoided criminal prosecution by cooperating with investigators, but his banking license had been revoked and he faced civil lawsuits from dozens of families seeking restitution for their losses. "Justice," Rex said simply, folding the letter and handing it back to Victoria. "Not just for us, but for everyone they tried to cheat." Victoria nodded, filing the letter away in the wooden box where she kept important documents, the same box that had once held her husband's deceptive correspondence now contained the deed to her mineral rights, their business licenses, and correspondence from the Territorial Attorney General thanking them for their courage in exposing the fraud. "I've been thinking about legacy lately," Victoria said as they prepared for the busy lunch hour, "about what we leave behind and how we're remembered." Rex paused in his task of arranging chairs around the dining room tables, giving her his full attention. "And what conclusions have you reached?" "That legacy isn't just about what we inherit from the past, it's about what we build for the future. This inn, our marriage, the example we set for how people should treat each other, that's the legacy that matters." Rex crossed the room to stand beside her, his hands settling on her waist with the natural ease of a man who no longer questioned his right to touch and be touched with love. "In that case, Mrs. Soon-to-be Dalton, I'd say we're building something worth being proud of." Victoria's smile was radiant as she leaned into his embrace, still marveling at how completely her life had transformed. 6 months ago, she had been a desperate widow, facing financial ruin and social isolation. Now, she was a successful businesswoman, engaged to a man who loved her without reservation, surrounded by a community that respected her courage and valued her contributions. "The afternoon stage will be arriving soon," she said, though she made no immediate move to leave Rex's arms. "We should prepare for new guests." "In a minute," Rex replied, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "I want to enjoy this moment a little longer. You, me, our inn, our future, all of it still feels too good to be entirely real." Victoria understood his sentiment completely. After years of struggle and disappointment, happiness felt fragile, something that might disappear if examined too closely. But the steady presence of Rex's love, the security of their financial situation, and the warmth of community acceptance had taught her to trust in good fortune when it finally arrived. "It's real," she said firmly. "We fought for it, we earned it, and we deserve to enjoy it." Outside, the sound of approaching hoofbeats announced the arrival of the afternoon stage, bringing new travelers who would experience the hospitality that had made the Dalton Meadows Inn famous throughout the territory. Victoria and Rex separated reluctantly, returning to their respective tasks with the comfortable efficiency of partners who had learned to work together seamlessly. As the sun set over Copper Ridge that evening, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that promised fair weather for tomorrow, Victoria stood once again on the inn's front porch, but this time she wasn't alone, and she wasn't looking backward with regret or forward with fear. Rex stood beside her, solid and dependable, his presence a reminder that some stories do have happy endings for those brave enough to write them. The sign above their heads caught the last rays of sunlight, its message clear and permanent. Here lived two people who had found each other in the midst of crisis and discovered that love, when built on truth and mutual respect, could weather any storm. Sometimes the best things in life really did come when you were least expecting them, riding in on tired horses and dressed in the most unexpected forms.